when it comes to modern geopolitical change, and there's no doubt that today we need to talk about the word power, and also, as the saying goes, power is important. But given the fact today, when we look at the complexity of the geopolitical change, I think the word diplomacy even matters more. But how should we understand the word diplomacy, given the fact that today no one is actually playing the games fairly? Selfishly speaking, every single country today is thinking about this geopolitical benefits and also this economic long-term planning partnership with some of the larger companies, some of the larger investment opportunities. In this episode, we need to bring one country into our conversation, which is the country of India. Given the fact today that India today is competing neck to neck with the neighboring country, for example, in China. As a matter of fact, some believe that India today, because of the growing competition, start to roll out what we called a tiger warrior diplomacy, which might sound similar to China's wolf warrior diplomacy. But meanwhile, this diplomacy has drawn heavy criticism and also could face backlash among the international communities. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, which is Mr. Kunal Purohit. Again, Kunal is a journalist in India. We're Kunal, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you so much, Will. It's an absolute pleasure joining you and chatting with you on this Sunday morning. Look forward to the chat, Will.
Absolutely, Kunal. Again, we're very excited to having this conversation with you too. Now, as we mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because this amazing article that you wrote, which is entitled Modi's Tiger Warrior Diplomacy, it's harming India's interests. Now, let's dive into the question right away. Within this article, you mentioned something, what we called, or what you addressed, called Hindu majoritism. And also, there's another popular term today we have to understand. It's called Hindu supremacy. Now, Kunal, from your perspective, let's start from the fundamental question. What is the difference, or what are the differences between those two? And also, why is that so significant for Narendra Modi, or even for the Modi government, to promote this Hindu majoritism? Your thoughts?
Well, to understand why Narendra Modi is invested in promoting this particular brand of politics, one has to understand the broader context of his politics and the politics of the party that he belongs to, the BJP. The BJP has been founded on the ideals of its ideological mothership of sorts, which is the RSS, which firmly believes in a Hindu-first approach, which has, in the past sort of denied the fact that India should be a secular country. They firmly believe that India should be a country first for the majority Hindus and then for the remaining populations of different religions. And that is really the premise on which Narendra Modi's politics is also based on. The brand of Hindu nationalism that I described is particularly this, is the belief that Hindus have to be placed above in the pecking order, above all the other religions that exist in India. As we all know, India is possibly one of the most diverse countries in the world. Its secularism and its pluralism have been its strengths since it became an independent nation in 1947. And the diversity that we see in India, both in terms of religions, also in terms of languages, is something that we've always taken pride in, and it's also a part of the Indian Constitution, which was written when India was made an independent country, when India became an independent country. But what has happened is, in this brand of Hindu nationalism, the diversity is not something that Hindu nationalists are particularly proud of. Hindu nationalists believe that in the race to become a secular country and provide equal opportunity, somewhere the Hindus have lost out on their primacy over other religions. And if you understand, Will, this is very similar to the rhetoric that a lot of the white nationalists in countries like the US and in other European countries have, where they believe that the white populations of those countries have lost out because the countries have seen migration by different communities and people of different races. And that is precisely also, somewhat of a sentiment that is found in Hindu nationalists. They believe that they were the original inhabitants of the land, and hence every other religion, people of every other religion, were originally Hindus, and hence Hindus, deserve a higher sort of pecking order, and a higher place in the pecking order, more so. So that is really what the politics of it is founded on. And this brand of politics has existed since the founding of the RSS in the 1920s. But the BJP under Mr. Modi has become possibly the most powerful expression of this brand of politics since India's independence. The BJP hasn't been in power for too long in India's modern history, barring a 5-year term between 2000, between 99 and 2004. The BJP has not really been in power directly. So these particular 10 years that Mr. Modi has been in power, those have been some of the sort of most strongest modes of expression that Hindu nationalism has found. Because Mr. Modi doesn't, he's not a part of a coalition government. His party currently enjoys a majority on its own. So he doesn't need other parties to come on board, which means that he gets more space to then pursue his brand of Hindu nationalist politics.
Kunal, it's interesting that you mentioned that Narendra Modi is very much interested in promoting this Hinduism or this Hindu supremacy. But meanwhile, let's go back to this article. Again, the article's entitled regarding this, what we called tiger warrior diplomacy. Again, it's similar, as I mentioned in the intro. Some called it neighboring country, which is China, tends to roll out this wolf warrior diplomacy. And also within the article, that it doesn't seem to be very pleasing and also, we'll say, satisfying for the West to understand this, what you called tiger warrior diplomacy. So my next question is, can you help us with better understanding what exactly is Modi's tiger warrior diplomacy? And also, given the fact he realized that if China continues to roll out this similar policy, China is not on a good term with any other country, for example, to be specific. So don't you think it's a dangerous diplomatic strategy if Narendra Modi chooses to go down the path, and also it's going to become much more difficult, can attract much greater economic partnership after rolling out, presumably, this tiger warrior diplomacy? Your thoughts?
So let me break down the response to that, Will. For those of the people who are listening into this and haven't read the piece, just to broadly give the context of why I call this tiger warrior diplomacy. What has happened in India today, especially as I said in the last 10 years, is that along with Hindu nationalism, a very powerful component of that Hindu nationalism is this projection of India as being somewhat of a rising superpower in the world. So, for instance, if you see the G20 summit that's going to happen in the next few days in New Delhi, the motto of the G20 summit under India's presidency is a Sanskrit phrase which stands for all of the world is a family. And that phase is also part of the BJP's manifesto, in sort of promoting this idea that that a Hinduized India looks at the entire world as its family, but that India deserves its rightful place as somewhat of a world leader. The exact phrase that Hindu nationalists use is Vishwa Guru, which literally means a leader of the world. So it's very important for India to project that it is no longer going to listen to lectures or strictures passed by any of the Western countries, for instance, on issues like human rights, as troubling as they may be in Modi's India right now. And that is the reason why in the Indian government under Mr. Modi has promoted what I call this very aggressive form of diplomacy, which believes that really turning the head on the word diplomacy. It really believes that we don't have to be diplomatic about what we stand for anymore. We have to be unabashed. We have to be brash sometimes. We have to be assertive and also arrogant, which may come across to a lot of people, because they believe that India's interests have to be protected, and India has to be constantly projected for a domestic audience. India has to be constantly projected as a country which is now not going to hold back its punches anymore. So that is the reason, that is the genesis of this brand of tiger warrior diplomacy. Where India really, for instance, I mean, I'll give you some examples. A few years ago, I think it was in 2020, when the United States brought out the U.S. Commission of International Religious Freedom, it pointed to India's and Mr. Modi's troubling record of treating its minorities, and to use the word, it called India a country of particular concern, because it believed that India was taking a downward turn when it came to protecting its secular values. And then the tiger warrior diplomacy comes in here. The response to this particular charge by the report came from India's foreign minister S. Jaishankar, who said that India designates the commission as an organization of particular concern. So it was almost a tit for tat. It wasn't, in my view, it wasn't a very nuanced or a measured response to what its criticisms could be. It didn't mean to logically sift through the criticism and address them, and then sort of offer rebuttals. It just sought to paint and broad brush this organization as having some sort of an agenda and calling it names. This is not what diplomacy, as we've known it, stands for. This is a different brand of, especially Indian diplomacy, which we've seen in the last 10 years, but mostly in the last 5 years. This is one example of the wolf warrior diplomacy. The tiger warrior diplomacy, which is somewhat similar to the wolf warrior diplomacy that China is known for. I'll give you another example of this. A few weeks ago, there was an Indian Parliament building that was inaugurated. It's a new building that was commissioned under Modi, and it was inaugurated by the Prime Minister himself. And the Parliament building featured a mural. The mural had what looked like a map of India, except that its boundaries were not set in modern day Indian boundaries. The map included, or what looked like, it included countries like Pakistan, like Bangladesh, parts of Afghanistan, into its fold, and also Nepal. So all of its immediate neighbors were included in the Indian, sort of the Indian territorial map that the mural contained. Now, obviously, all of India's neighbors complained. All of them issued statements. There were, in fact, even street protests against this map in countries like Nepal, which have always been very friendly to India. And among one of the countries that protested was also our neighbor Pakistan, with whom, as your listeners would know, India hasn't shared cordial ties since the two countries separated in 1947. Now, the response to something like this should have been a lot more measured. But again, India's foreign minister, when he was asked, about Pakistan's criticism and its objections to the map showing Pakistan to be a part of India, he said, I don't expect Pakistan to understand. Those are the kind of statements where I sort of, again want to point out to this projection that India will not hold back its punches. India doesn't need to explain its stances anymore, and India is a rising superpower, and no one should really be sort of confident enough to tell India what to do, because India knows best. And that is really the brand of diplomacy that the Modi regime is increasingly standing for, Will.
Kunal, it's rather significant that you repeated yourself many times that it's time today that India is no longer holding back its punches. But let's bring another piece of reality into our conversation. India is going to host the G20 summit. But meanwhile, India just participated the BRICS summit, and also India is a very active member in the Quad relationship. To be honest, not too long ago, I spoke to another expert on Indian foreign policy. the way the person put it to say, India today, it's a very active in engaging with the foreign policy. So in other words, it doesn't matter it's invited or uninvited. India would like to build a presence and also to form this relationship with any other country whatsoever. Now, the question to you is, hypothetically, if under Narendra Modi continue to roll out this tiger warrior diplomacy, how do you think it's going to play out with other partners in the Quad or in the BRICS or in the G20 summit? So in other words, I mean, again, let's bring another piece of information is we're looking at the war in Ukraine today. The last thing we want is to create another enemy with any other partners. I think today we need more partnership. We don't need more enemies, or we don't need more conflicts. So based on your coverage and based on your report, as you mentioned before, the beef with the mural map and also the explanation with the Pakistan, etc., how do you think Narendra Modi or this Modi administration it's balancing the conflict and also managing or handling this tiger warrior diplomacy at the same time? What do you think?
I think we're already seeing signs of this brand of diplomacy hurting Indian interests. And this is precisely what the point of the piece was, to argue that it is now beginning to hurt India's interests. So, for instance, in June, Prime Minister Modi made a state visit to the US, and he was hosted by President Joe Biden. While a lot of the media coverage was focused on how the visit was such a great success, and he delivered a speech to both houses. He was hosted at a state banquet. While all of this was true, what was also simultaneously happening was there were a lot of protests by people in Washington, D.C., including by congressmen and congresswomen, as well as senators. So that was the other side of it. For instance, even when Prime Minister Modi addressed both houses, there were a lot of empty seats because a lot of senators and Congress people decided to boycott the speech, and then these are according to media reports from the US. So you're already seeing that happen. The other example that I'd like to give you is that simultaneously, while Mr. Modi was in the US, what we saw happening in Brussels was that the European Parliament was discussing and then approved with a majority a resolution that condemned the Indian government, but Mr. Modi's policies of Hindu nationalism and how it is driving a wedge between different religions in the Indian northeastern state of Manipur, where we're seeing two different tribal groups really at a war with each other for the last 4 odd months now. So we're already seeing this pushback by different players. We're also seeing how different countries may not be explicitly coming out and sort of speaking about this on the podium, but as I mentioned previously, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, when it's issuing such statements, it's a part of the U.S. government. It's not an independent. I mean, it is an autonomous body, but it is still an American entity, and its reports are typically released by the U.S. Secretary of State. So when the reports talk of how India is a country of particular concern, how India is taking a downward slope, and how India's policies are increasingly targeting India's minorities, let's be very clear that this is all being taken note of in various state capitals. What is happening, thankfully for the Modi government, is that because we're now seeing strategic competition between China and the rest of the world in some ways heating up. A lot of the Western powers are placing and hedging their bets on India as somewhat of a regional power, who could counter China in the region, especially. It is really statecraft where we're trying to create an alternative power in the region who could keep China somewhat tied down and engaged in the region, while China has global aspirations and global ambitions. So what we're seeing as a result of that, Will, is that India's stock is clearly rising among foreign countries who are apprehensive of China's rise. which is why you're seeing a lot of foreign nations wanting to invest in India, wanting to build stronger ties with India. Um, but the larger arc of this journey, Will, is somewhat disturbing, because we've seen over and over, and there are various examples in modern history where, each time a certain region becomes the focus of attention for the world, it's only a matter of time before the world decides to move on to the next
Mm.
such region, right? And the most potent example is what we saw in Afghanistan, where, suddenly the US decided one day that it was going to pack its bag and go off and hand over power to the very same guys who it had fought against and it had unseated. This is exactly what I'm trying to also warn in the piece, that while India's strategic sort of viability and India's strategic advantages at this point are rather high, and as a result of which India will not face any major pushback from any of these, especially the Western countries
Mm.
who hope to build stronger ties, it shouldn't take this support for granted,
Mm.
beyond the medium term, because things can change and things ultimately do change. There is no status quo that remains forever, especially in a field as fickle as geopolitics.
That's right, Kunal. Again, I agree with you. At this moment, when we look at the war in Ukraine and we're looking at, again, the complexity of the geopolitical change, nothing is certain or nothing can be certain at this moment. Now, let's move on to the next question. Within the article, that, again, couple statements that regarding what we called India's global image. Let me ask a very simple question. How much do you think Narendra Modi actually care about the global image today? I mean, again, I might use one example. We can criticize any other countries. We're looking at from this economic perspective. We'll look at from this foreign policy or social changes. It's fair to say that every single country today is being criticized for certain reasons. Some countries, they care about their global image greatly, and they will love to repolish, they will love to refurnish their images so that they can gain more attraction. Other countries basically roll out this diplomacy to say, you say whatever you want, but I don't really care. So at this moment, from your perspective, despite everything you just explained, how much do you think that Narendra Modi actually care about the global image? Or is it time for him to say, hey, listen, we are a different country, we have different history, and we have different diplomacy, we have different relationship, so why don't you mind your own business and let us to do what we can do, because we are the Indians and we know the history and we know the strategy better than anyone else in the world. What do you think?
That is what is so fascinating, Will, about the Modi regime, is that it constantly sorts to project this image that it doesn't really care about what the world says. And as I said, that India is not going to hold back anymore, except at the same time. The projection of India being a global power is extremely important to Narendra Modi's brand of politics right now. What is important to him as in the domestic circuit, especially in the domestic audiences that he has, is to project himself as somewhat of a global statesman whose word is paid heed to, whose charisma cuts across differences. That sort of image is extremely popular, especially on Indian social media, which is really full of a lot of this kind of projection by Modi's party, the BJP. So we see a lot of videos, we see a lot of memes, we see a lot of WhatsApp messages, and on Facebook as well, which constantly seek to project India's image as somewhat of a global power. So it is important for Mr. Modi to project India and for it to care about India's image. But at the same time, it also wants to constantly signal to its domestic constituents that India doesn't really matter what the world says or thinks about it, right? So this dichotomy is often seen, very glaringly, and the contradictions are very, very clear sometimes. And I'll give you an example of this. When the Manipur resolution that I just spoke about a few minutes ago was being tabled in the European Parliament, India's response to it was that it doesn't really care about these resolutions, that it doesn't have to justify itself. But just at the same time, and I'm going to take us, a couple of years back, 3 years ago, when India decided to strip, the conflict-ridden the region of Jammu and Kashmir of its special status. There was a lot of international condemnation of how India decided to do it. It was really an overnight decision. Thousands of people, thousands of political activists, thousands of political leaders, ordinary citizens were all placed under house arrest, and were all detained in different parts of the region. When the Narendra Modi government decided to bring in a special law in the Indian Parliament and get it approved, where it said that the region's special status doesn't remain anymore. Now, at that point, to counter the criticism of the world, what it decided to do was that it decided to get a bunch of European members of parliament and take them to Kashmir to show them how Kashmir was absolutely normal, and that people were happy, and that the criticism was really unwarranted. So it organized a tour at a time when it was being very, very careful about even letting journalists go there and report freely, right? But it decides to get all of these MPs to come to Jammu and Kashmir and show them and highlight the normalcy of the region. But when it came recently to the Manipur resolution, which was approved by the same European Parliament, India turns around and says, "Oh, but we don't need your validation at all. We will do what we have to do." So these glaring contradictions often bear themselves, and this contradiction, I would argue, is really at the heart of India's foreign policy under the Narendra Modi government. That it will seek to burnish its image as somewhat of a global leader, while also telling its domestic constituents that it doesn't really care for international validation.
Absolutely, Kunal. Again, I agree with you 100%. I think today, when we look at, again, the complexity of the relationship between US and China, of course, it's not fair to get everyone involved. But meanwhile, it is rather tricky for the country of India to maintain its international balance, and also to seeing this economic projection without being interfered by any international crisis, such as the war in Ukraine, the deadlock between US and China, and also we'll look at this military growing in Asia, etc. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Mr. Kunal Purohit. And again, Kunal, it's a international journalist. And again, I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out his latest article, which is entitled "Modi's Tiger Warrior Diplomacy, It's Harming India's Interest." Well, Kunal, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to monitor this political and also this economic change in India and also the matters around the world. So thank you so much for doing this.